Hey y'all. Today I'm going to be talking about the causes of the Great Depression. And then I'm going to talk about the New Deal in a different video, just so it's kind of broken up a bit. But the Great Depression was a very important time in American history. And for reasons that I'll discuss when we get to the New Deal, I think in long term, it made America better. But first of all, so what caused the Great Depression? I will say I'm not an economist, and I'll also say that economists don't agree about all this. So um, there's a bit of not everyone's in agreement, but it's important to understand like the causes because that's what keeps us from having another Great Depression. So I'm sure y'all remember when the pandemic started in 2020, a few months in, we all got money from the government. They sent us checks. You got more if you had kids. So we got quite a bit of money. And I just want to ask y'all, like, why do you think the government sent everybody money? Um, sure, it was to be nice, but it was to avoid another economic depression. So that was a lesson learned from the Great Depression, that people have to have money in order to spend money. And if you don't want the economy to completely collapse, you have to make it possible for people to have money so that they can spend that money. So here are some of the causes of the Depression. In the 1920s, people thought the economy was doing great. On the surface, it looked like it was booming, um, but it really kind of wasn't. People were buying a lot of stuff, and so that kept the economy and the stock market really strong. But the problem was that people were buying things on credit. They had just come up with this idea that you can buy things with money you don't have, you can do layaway, you can pay over time. So that encouraged people to buy all this stuff that they really couldn't afford. And they weren't savvy as far as it comes to borrowing, and that was something that was fairly new for consumers. So they hadn't learned the lesson yet of, don't get too far in debt. But so throughout the 1920s, the stock market kept going up. And if you know anything about the stock market, you know that when the stock prices go up, it makes it makes it seem like that company, whatever company stock it is, it makes it seem like that company's doing really well. When the stocks start going down, that company's like not doing quite as well. So stock market prices kept going up, and people kept making a ton of money from stocks. And that just creates like desires to make more and more money. So people made money once, so they want to keep doing it over and over again. And they had this confidence that stock prices will keep rising. Um, Again, not a lot of understanding of the economy. So people were buying stocks and, for most of the 1920s making money. But the bubble burst, as they say. In October 1929, the stock market crashed. And what that means is stock prices had gotten so high that the stock price did not represent the value of the company. Stocks are supposed to represent like how much money that company's worth, but when people buy a lot of stocks, the stock prices increase. So they increase to a point where it no longer represents how much the company's worth, which is, what it's supposed to do. But more and more people buying made them go up. I don't know if y'all remember the GameStop thing a few years ago. It was during the pandemic, and people using social media, people coordinated this manipulation of the stock market. Um, Thousands and thousands of people across the country agreed to buy stocks in GameStop. And they did that because so many people buying it meant that the stock price was going to shoot up, and then they could sell and make money. That was the plan, and it actually worked. But then there was a lot of question of whether or not that's legal. But that the point is that when a lot of people buy a stock in a certain company, it does increase. When a lot of people start selling stocks in a certain company, that the value decreases. So during the 1920s, it just seemed like it was going to increase forever. So people just bought more and more. And they borrowed money from banks to buy stocks, which is now illegal. But this is what they did. They borrowed money. And so when the stock market crashed, which means like all of a sudden, like stock prices were so high that they weren't realistic. They didn't represent real value. And so prices started going down pretty dramatically, and it made people want to sell their stocks as quickly as possible because they want to sell them before they go down even more. So when people noticed that the prices were decreasing, there were so many people who just tried to get rid of every stock that they had. But I mean, this is the days before, sorry, years before the internet. And a lot of people just didn't know. I mean, this happened in New York City. A lot of people in other parts of the country didn't know. They didn't get instant communication. So, on the day that the stock market crashed in New York City, several people killed themselves, people who lost everything in the stock market. So, not only did they lose the money that they had invested, but they also couldn't pay back the bank for money they had borrowed to buy stocks. And that's called speculation, where you borrow money, you buy stocks with money you don't have. And this is what created such a huge problem because now the banks weren't getting repaid for the money that they loaned to people to buy stocks. And when you put your money in a bank, that money is used by the bank to give out loans. The bank does not actually have that much money, but they have to have a certain amount that represents sort of how much they've given out in loans. So a lot of people found themselves unable to pay back the banks, which means that the banks started to fail. And what that means when a bank fails is that it no longer has your money. So people put all their money in the banks, and all of a sudden, all the banks were shutting down like very suddenly. And all across the country, people who had money in the banks were outside of the banks banging on the doors. They stayed for days just banging on the doors, trying to get into the bank to get their money. But the banks had just shut down. There was no way those people were getting their money again. There was a man who was a janitor, and he saved his money for 40 years and put it in the bank. And he stood outside of that bank, pounding on the doors in the rain, in the cold. And once he finally accepted the fact that he was never going to see his money again, he killed himself. So, this is how serious it was. So, you might think that the stock market crash only affected people who own stocks. But as they say, the problem went from Wall Street to Main Street being sort of like, every small town. The reason that the problem spread to everyone was because when people who own a lot of stocks find themselves suddenly bankrupt, they are usually the people who own businesses, corporations. They're usually the wealthy people. So when they lost all their money, their corporation stocks were just rapidly going down, rapidly. So the business that they own was no longer making money, no longer sustainable. So they had to either close the business, which means all their employees are suddenly unemployed, or they had to reduce their labor force, which means some of their employees were now unemployed. But what most of them did was they cut wages. I mean, can you imagine working somewhere making $10 an hour, and all of a sudden you're told that you're now making $8 an hour? So this kind of economic crisis affected everybody because once people start making less money, they spend less money. They become more careful with their spending. And this is something I mentioned in the 1920s video. But if you found yourself unemployed all of a sudden, you might not go out to eat that night. You might not go to a movie or a hockey game or things that cost money. All of a sudden, you're like, oh my gosh, I need to save my money. So people stopped spending money. And when people stop spending money, that's what leads to a depression because they're not going to their favorite restaurant that night because they're broke. So the people who own the restaurants make less money, and then they have to start laying off their employees. and cutting wages, which means all those employees now are not buying as much stuff because they found themselves like not having a steady income. So they stopped spending money. They stopped going to the movies. Movies were really big during this time. So eventually it's just like this cycle that affected every single person. Another problem that caused the Great Depression was that throughout the 1920s, there was an overproduction of goods. There was a lot of consumer goods that were being overproduced, especially cars. And this is again kind of from the 1920s. We talked about how after World War One, there was a fear that a depression was going to hit because all those factories that were producing war weapons, they were going to have to, stop producing as much, which would mean layoffs, and the whole cycle begins. So instead of making military war equipment and supplies, they began to make consumer supplies, consumer goods. So all these new consumer goods were invented and encouraged. People were encouraged to buy it because of radio advertisements and the fact that you could buy things on layaway. So underconsumption meant that there was an overproduction, meant that the price of those goods decline. And I think this is one of the weirdest things that people have a hard time understanding. When prices go down, it is not good. It's even worse than inflation. Prices going down means that there's a problem. So in the case of the Great Depression, companies just had to cut back on how much they were producing because they couldn't sell the stuff anymore. So cutting back on how much they're producing means they're laying off their labor force, which means those people now can't spend money, and it's just a cycle. So overproduction was a big problem. If you recall, it was a big problem before World War One, and that was one of the reasons why the US got in the war, was to create a manufacture of supplies for the fighting nations in Europe. And factories were all of a sudden at full capacity. Unemployment dropped significantly because there was so much need for labor during the war, because there was a need for production of things like tanks and radios and weapons and all that stuff. So after the war ended, there was this fear that we got to keep producing all this stuff, or otherwise we're gonna cause a depression. So the consumer items came in the 1920s. Cars were a big consumer item in the 20s, and many people owned a car, and so that seemed to be the indicator of economic growth, like how many cars are being sold. In 1927, the rate of car purchasing went down for the first time. People stopped buying as many cars. And the reason is pretty obvious. Once you have a car or a radio or whatever it is, most people don't feel the need to buy another one. So you have your car, you're going to keep it for a certain number of years. And this meant that car purchasing was going to decline. So nowadays, in order to prevent that, things like new models of things like cell phones, new models of cars come out every year, and that's supposed to encourage people to buy a new one like every year. Computers are designed to not last that long, and that's intentional so that people will keep buying computers. So there was this problem that people couldn't buy all the surplus stuff, so the prices started going down. People at first weren't alarmed by that. Economists were, but everyday people were, glad the prices went down. But it was really a problem because things became worthless. Even food was being overproduced during the 20s. And the food prices started to drop because farmers were producing too much that nobody was buying. And if you have all this surplus of stuff that no one's buying, the natural tendency is to start lowering your prices. And once you lower your prices, your competition feels compelled to do the same. So prices in general start lowering. And then, of course, that means layoffs and the whole cycle. So overproduction and underconsumption was a big factor. And it started affecting farmers in the 20s, like even before it affected like corporations. Throughout the 1920s, farmers were already struggling with this. Cotton in the South was being way overproduced. wheat in the West, like all kinds of things were being overproduced and prices were dropping. The value was declining because there was too much. Um, Another sort of factor that led to the Depression was the fact that during the 1920s, the American government kind of returned to laissez faire economics, which means leave alone. It means the government doesn't restrict or regulate anything to do with the economy. So that was a big change from the 1920s. In the 20s, people sort of went back to this idea of laissez faire. And it's because the economy seemed to be doing so well that they thought the government should just back off and let the economy do its thing. Well, that became problematic eventually because without any regulations, things are not things are not going to go smoothly forever. So, return to laissez-faire economics was a big one. Um, Another issue was the Dawes Plan, and that was mentioned last week. This kind of triangle of money, borrowing, and um, returning, borrowing money, and paying off someone else. So the United States was loaning money to Germany so that Germany could repay France and England, and that allowed France and England to repay the United States for the money that they borrowed during the war. And when the US economy crashed in 1929, really short after that in 1930, the United States stopped the Dawes Plan like abruptly. They were like, we can't loan money to Germany anymore. So that meant that Germany was going to be in a really bad state. It meant that they couldn't repay France and England. So France and England began to suffer economically. And then in turn, it meant that France and England couldn't repay the United States. So all four of these economies began to struggle because the source of all that money was the United States. So the Depression started to spread around the world, especially to countries that relied on exports like Japan. Japan makes a lot of stuff and they rely on selling it to the world. All of a sudden, people weren't buying stuff. So this became a global issue. Um, and another thing that's closely related to this was President Hoover, who was president when the Depression started. He thought that it would be a good idea to increase the tariff. Like after the Depression started, he was like, "Oh, I guess a solution might be to raise our tariffs." So tariffs are taxes on imported items, and he thought that if we raise our tariff, it will encourage people to buy American made products because all of a sudden foreign products have this extra tax put on them. And it would also generate income for the government. The tariffs would be used by the government. So that was actually the worst decision. Economists now say that that was a horrible decision to increase the tariff because when one country raises their tariffs, other countries raise their tariffs. So if I'm going to charge you a certain fee on your item, then you're going to retaliate and charge me a certain fee on the item I'm trying to sell you. So this basically led to a stop in international trade. Nobody wanted to buy foreign products because they all had this extra tax put on them. And so the United States was having a hard time selling products to other countries. So the Depression hit Japan really hard, Germany really hard, and of course the United States. Um, those are, gosh, it was this beginning of a cycle that it was very hard for the government to know what to do. And because of the Great Depression, we now know that when overproduction starts to become a problem, that we need to reduce production and possibly give people money. So during the pandemic, the federal government sent us money because they didn't want everyone to stop spending money. Because they learned from the Great Depression. If people aren't making money, they can't spend money, which means that the whole cycle is going to begin. The whole cycle of like people cutting back on spending, which means the businesses have to cut back on labor. And it just becomes this whole thing that's really hard to fix. So that's why the government sent us money so we could continue to spend money and prevent an economic depression. All right, so a lot of times people say that the Dust Bowl led to the Depression, but I really want to emphasize that the Dust Bowl didn't start until about 5 years after the Depression started. So, like around 1935 is when all those dust storms started really crippling the West. So that was a real big problem for farmers in Western states. But that happened in 1935. So we can't really say that it was a cause of the Depression. It made it worse, but it didn't cause it. Um, I think think that's I'm just making sure I didn't leave. Oh, I almost left something important out. Another problem during the 1920s was that there was a vastly unequal distribution of wealth. There was a small amount of people who made a lot of money. They were very, very wealthy, but the majority of people did not make a lot of money. So there was a huge gap between the rich and the poor. And that's always a problem because if you're rich and you want to sell things, who are you going to sell them to if everyone's poor? So that's one reason we have minimum wage now. One of many reasons. Like you have people have to be able to afford the products that you're making or otherwise you're not going to sell them. So Henry Ford with the assembly line was really the first to realize this. And he began to increase wages when car production started declining. Most people would have decreased wages, but he realized, like, okay, people are buying less cars because one reason because they don't have enough money to buy a new car. So he increased the wages for his employees. He gave them $5 an hour, which was a lot back then. And he said, when someone asked him why he was doing that, he said, "Well, if the people who work here and make cars, if they can't afford to buy cars, who's going to buy the cars?" And so he was kind of an early thinker who kind of realized this very quickly. But because of all these problems, some economic changes were put in place during the Great Depression, like minimum wage, child labor restrictions, things that I'll talk more about in the next video. But that's why I said that in the long run, I think the Great Depression made the United States better. It's unfortunate that it happened because the people suffered through it, and it was also a huge factor in causing World War II. Germany got out of their depression very, very quickly. The United States didn't. The reason Germany got out of their depression was the best way to make money, the best way to make an economy boom is go to war. And sad but true, going to war is great for the economy because all of a sudden corporations do not have an overproduction problem anymore. They need more products, they need more labor. And so more people, get employed and there's more competition. Like companies really need labor, so they start offering higher pay in order to get you to work for them because they're needed everywhere. So this is another thing I noticed, like when the pandemic was starting to end, wages went up because companies could not find enough employees. And so in order to get you to work for them instead of some other company, they increased wages. I remember seeing a sign on McDonald's while I was driving by, and it was like $15 an hour. So that's like a lot higher than it was before. But they really needed people. So this is what happened in Germany. They started producing for the war, and this was forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles. They were not allowed to produce for the war. But Hitler was in power, and once he started doing that, he started building Germany's war machine. Their economy started booming, and nobody really did anything about it, even though they were clearly breaking the Treaty of Versailles. Nobody stepped up and said, "Hey, you can't do that." Primarily because the US was in such economic crisis and other countries as well that they didn't prioritize that. Their main priority was like, let's fix our problems and we don't need to worry about what Germany's doing. So Germany was getting ready to go to war. And once, Hitler, once he breaks a law, like the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, and no one does anything about it, it just encourages him to keep doing it because he realized that there's no repercussions. So this is one reason why the Great Depression led to World War II. Another one is just the the devastation of the 1930s led people to, first of all, people who control the economy, people who kind of know this stuff, they realized that the only way to get out of the depression was to go to war. And that's not something you tell the public, right? You don't say we got to go to war because it'll help our economy. No one's going to agree with that. So that was understood by, people kind of in government. But Also, just the devastation that the depression caused, created a lot of conflict between countries. Immigration, basically stopped. The 1930s was the only time that more Americans left America than came to America. And a lot of Americans went to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was communist, and from the outside, it looked great. Everybody had a job. There was this idea of equality. So many Americans went there thinking that their life would be better if they lived under a communist government. So communism became very popular in the 1930s in the United States. It was the heyday of communism. But for the Americans who went there, sure, like they had a home and food and medical care and all that covered by the government. But um, no one knew how bad it was there. It was awful. People were being arrested, tortured for expressing anything negative about the country or the government, or just not showing enough loyalty. Um, it got really bad and really bizarre, but their economy was doing well, so that made other people think maybe communism is the way to go. So all of these things kind of come back to the economic crisis. So I want you to be able to explain why the Great Depression led to World War II. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Okay, I'll stop there, and in the next video, we'll talk about the New Deal, which was Franklin Roosevelt's plan to end the Depression.